This evening's speaker is Dr. Lee Silver, who has traveled here this evening from Princeton University to share some thoughts on how we as individuals and as societies deal with frontiers. Dr. Silver, with his family in tow, I might add, has traveled around the globe to observe firsthand how cultural values and beliefs shape perspectives on and acceptance of biotechnologies. Dr. Silver shares these observations in his new book, courtesy of Dave Harry here, Challenging Nature, The Clash of Spirituality and Science at the New Frontiers of Life, which was released this past summer. One definition of frontier, taken from Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, is a geographic concept as, quote, a region that forms the margin of settled or developed territory, end quote. But a second definition of frontier, also taken from Webster's, is an intellectual concept as, quote, the farthermost limits of knowledge or achievement in a particular subject, end quote. In agricultural biotechnology, both of these definitions are applicable. Today, there are upwards of 90 million hectares of land planted to genetically modified or genetically engineered crops. In total area, that's roughly equivalent to twice the area of California, or about 2.5% of the Earth's total cropland. Now, these are big numbers, but GM crops, or genetically modified crops, are not uniformly distributed around the globe. So these croplands represent a frontier in agricultural geography. But agricultural and medical biotechnologies, such as stem cells, also represent an intellectual frontier. As biologists acquire more skills in understanding and manipulating biological processes, other members of society are questioning both the research itself and its application. What is the basis of these people's concerns? Some questions are rooted in science and the technology itself. Do the techniques really work? What are the benefits and what are the downsides? Other questions, however, are more deeply rooted in what people believe. Such beliefs extend beyond the rational. This evening, Lee Silver will share his thoughts on both the science and beliefs. Lee Silver received his undergrad and master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania in physics and his PhD in biophysics from Harvard. He shared a story this evening to say that he never had a biology class as an undergrad, and so his biology is self-taught. Perhaps I shouldn't have shared that, but I decided it was. But he's done a good job of it, I might say. He has authored or edited 6 books and has authored nearly 200 scholarly papers. His earlier research focused on mouse genetics, but in more recent years, he's tackled broader questions dealing with the science and public policy. Dr. Silver has been on the faculty at Princeton since the mid-'80s, where he's professor of molecular biology, as well as a professor in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he was a member of the New Jersey Bioethics Commission Task Force recommending reproductive policy for the New Jersey State Legislature. He has appeared on numerous television programs, including NBC Nightly News, the Jim Lehrer NewsHour, ABC Nightline, the Charlie Rose Show, and many others. This evening, Dr. Lee Silver will speak on Challenging Nature, the clash between biotechnology and spirituality. Please join me in welcoming Lee to Oregon State University.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here on the West Coast, just as rainy here as it was when I left New York this morning. And what I'm going to tell you about is really the experiences that I've had over the last 5 years and how they've changed my views, or not changed my views in some ways, about biotechnology. So I started off as a professor in molecular biology at Princeton, doing molecular biology, which is the core science behind biotechnology. And I wrote a book, actually, a trade book in 1996 called Remaking Eden, which talked about the possibility of using techniques that we were using with mice, like genetic engineering and what would soon be cloning technology, and the possibility that technology might be used someday in human beings. So I wasn't advocating the technology, I was just speculating about its use. And the response I got from many people was so much one of outrage. I wanted to understand where all this came from. And so in the year 2000, as Dave just said, I decided I wanted to go out and see the way the rest of the world thought, which I came to see, was very, very differently than the way molecular biologists viewed the world. And in fact, as you can see over here on this globe, my family flew into an island right here in Indonesia, one-way ticket, and we just sort of backpacked our way across Asia for 9 months, which was very nice. And I learned a lot there because people were willing to talk about their feelings about religion and spirituality in a much more open way than is typical in secular Western society, which we live in. And that's what I'm going to tell you about tonight. And so the way of looking at biotechnology, this is sort of my icons over here. In the middle, those of you who've had genetics will recognize this is the blue is the DNA molecule, and it's associated with a regulatory protein. That's the way molecular biologists can look inside a living thing right now. On the bottom is actually beating heart tissue, which was developed out of embryonic stem cells. And the idea is to be able to develop technologies like this to be able to overcome diseases in humankind. It's the way molecular biologists look at the world. On the right, it's from the Sistine Chapel in Rome, another way of looking at the meaning of life. And on the left, as I will talk about later tonight as I get into the meat of the talk, is the globe as a whole, which many people see as a single organism, given the metaphorical name Gaia. So biotechnology is contentious, and I don't like talking about things that are not controversial, so I'll focus on the controversial uses of the technology. And basically, my talk tonight will be about the use of human embryos in medical therapies, which is one aspect of controversial biotechnology. And the second is genetically modified crops and animals. Since this is a university that is geared towards agriculture very, very strongly, I'll focus on the second more than the first part of this twofold talk. And if you want to learn more about what I think about the first part, you can take a look at my book. So the thesis basically is that spiritual beliefs play a role, consciously or subconsciously, in the acceptance or rejection of each of these biotechnologies. Some people accept the first, don't like the second. Some people like the second, don't like the first. Some people like both. And in all of these cases, when I've talked to people, I very often find that there is an emotional or spiritual reaction to biotechnology that's not based on pure, rational, scientific analysis. And so that's what I'm going to approach tonight. And this is basically the outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. First, about the different conceptions people have about life and what it means to be alive, what it means to be a human being. I will then go into Christian, Asian, and post-Christian worldviews, and those different kind of category of ways of looking at life and spirituality and how they affect how you think about those two kinds of biotechnology. Then I'll talk about the misperceived goddess of Mother Nature and the real problem, which is where I'm going to end up. The real problem in my mind is the contradiction and between food production and wilderness preservation and the yin-yang of this problem and how we might deal with it in the future. Okay, so first, what does it mean to be alive? Now, the traditional Western response is one that is expressed by a man named Leon Kass, who is a professor at the University of Chicago. He was also the first chairman of President Bush's Bioethics Council. And this is from a book that he wrote in 2002. And he said, modern biology is inherently incapable of understanding life as lived, not only by human beings, but by any living thing. Life and soul are irreducibly mysterious. Now, this is a very interesting statement, because even though this Professor Kass has an MD and a PhD in biochemistry, actually, from Harvard, this is a very unscientific statement. A scientist would say, if they thought the way Leon Kass thought, a good scientist would say, modern biology perhaps is incapable of understanding life, or perhaps it might be impossible, but they wouldn't have this declarative statement, modern biology is inherently incapable. That is not a hypothesis, that is a point of view which basically says that I don't accept any other point of view, which is the point of view expressed, and it's expressed here by the very famous picture on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The idea is that God on the right gives the spark of life by touching the hand of Adam over here on the left. And that spark is a mystery. And we can't possibly understand what that mystery is. And this is a little video that I took from a movie called Look Who's Talking. And it's at the very beginning of the movie. And it's very interesting because you see here all the sparks coming out. This is fertilization. And it's in the opening credits. And it's the way that many people in the West think about fertilization. They see the fertilization, they see the sparks, the lightning. That's the creation of a human being by God. And it's a metaphor that rings true to a lot of people. Now, molecular biologists, I would say typical molecular biologists, see life in a very different way. And here is a living organism, just sort of a general, generic living organism. And the way the living organism works in the mind of a molecular biologist is that it stays alive by bringing in energy, food. The food can be chemical food. We eat chemical food, or it can be, if the living organism is a plant, it could actually take photons directly, sunlight directly. In any case, it brings energy in, and it processes that energy. And it's not important to know all the chemicals. If you've taken a biology course, you'll recognize this as part of the metabolic pathway. But the point is the energy comes in, it is converted into a series of different chemicals which store the energy. These chemicals are also used to build the structures that determine the structure of the entire organism. And that energy is also used with signals from the environment in a process of information processing. So you have energy that's coming in, it's processed over here, the energy and the environment come together in this information processing network. Now, this is not just a metaphor. This is actually a small portion of the information processing network, the genetic information processing network that controls the development of the sea urchin during early development. And what you're seeing is different genes, and the products of different genes control the regulation of other genes. The environmental signals are coming in. Environmental signals as well as internal signals are going to all be processed together. That leads to an active response whose whole point is to generate more, allow the organism to get more food in a most efficient way, and then the whole thing goes round and round and round. This, to my mind, is basically the way a molecular biologist would define a living thing, any living thing. The idea of taking in energy, being able to process it, being able to process information, having a response which allows it to process more energy to keep itself maintained. You cut off the energy and the thing dies. As long as it has energy, it can go around in a circle. That's life, believe it or not, in a molecular biologist's view. There are other aspects of life that are not essential for all living things, even though they're the goals of most living things. And the other aspects of life are growth, development, and reproduction, but I'm not growing anymore. I'm not reproducing. There are lots of living things that don't reproduce or grow. And development, whether I'm developing or not, I don't know. But those may be the goals of living things, but they're not necessary for something to be alive, is the point I'm trying to make. Now, are there unknowns? Absolutely. There are tons and tons of unknowns. But if you ask the molecular biologist whether this system was a mystery, most would say no. It's a very, very complicated puzzle. We have some of the information, some of the parts of the puzzle. We have a good idea of the general working of the system, even if we don't know all of the details. Very different than the way Leon Kass views the living world. Now, if you view life like this, it becomes kind of difficult because there are things, and I want you to look at that picture up there on the right. Those are dogs created by the Sony Corporation. They're electronic dogs, and they're playing soccer, as you can see. And they have intent. They're not being controlled by people. Each one of those dogs, and there's a red team and there's a black team, and each one of those dogs is basically trying to score goals for its team. And some of the dogs play defense, and some play offense, and there's a goalie you may see soon, maybe not. And this has a network of the same kind of network that I just told you living things have, right? It has energy coming in, the chemical energy coming in. It's electrical energy that drives these organisms. They have information processing network. They're trying to score goals over here, and the other team's trying to stop them from scoring goals. So does that mean that these things are alive? Well, look at those things over there, and look at a sea urchin over here on the left. This is actually a sea urchin I saw myself while snorkeling this summer in the Galapagos. And I watched this sea urchin for 5 minutes, and it didn't move. And yet, we consider that to be alive. Obviously, there's stuff going inside of it. And most of us would have a difficult time saying that that over there was alive. Emotionally, we can't attribute life to that, even though these dogs are going to get more and more, not just dogs, but these kinds of man-made devices are going to become closer and closer and closer to what we consider to be living things. I mean, if the Greek philosophers came back from 2,000 years ago and they just sort of, time travel to today, Aristotle, Plato, people like that, they would look at these things, they didn't know anything else, and they'd say, of course they're alive. They have all the characteristics of life. So what makes, the sea urchin's alive, maybe those dogs are alive, I don't know. What makes human life different? I want you to take a look at these 3 videos here. And they're all representations of life. And these are single-cell organisms. They're amoeba, moving around, sensing their environment. These are single-cell organisms as well. Each one of these is an independent life form. And this over here is a 4 to 8 cell human embryo. There's a bunch of cells, and they're sort of bouncing around. And we would say there are a lot of people who say that that organism on the right is a human being. It is a human embryo, and it could develop into a human being, a baby that would breathe and think, just like you or me. But they typically wouldn't say that this middle organism or these middle organisms were human beings. But these are actually human organisms. These are human cells. They're independent from each other. They're human microorganisms. But they're alive, and they're human, and which suggests to me that nobody would think that these things are human beings, which means that there's not an equivalence between human life and human beings. Because if there was an equivalent of everything that was a human life was a human being, then the cells that fall off your skin when you take a shower, and you can grab them in a petri dish like that, then all of those cells would be human beings deserving of respect, and we don't normally think in those terms. Some people would say, well, those are single cells. They're not a human being. They're microorganisms, and the embryo over there is also a microorganism. So people can look at this in very different ways based on not necessarily scientific beliefs, actually not scientific beliefs, but more of an emotional, spiritual way of looking at these organisms. So what does it mean to be a human being? I'm not going to answer that question tonight. I don't have enough time, but I do deal with this question in my book, so you can read that. Here's my son over there, and he is standing next to a chimpanzee, and we all recognize my son as a human being, and the chimpanzee is not a human being. That's clear, but it's not so clear how we make distinctions down here in this bottom row, and I'm not going to go further into that because I don't have enough time, and I want to focus more on genetically modified crops. But I want to show you a map of the world in terms of the way that different countries have approached the issue of embryo cloning. So embryo cloning is taking the genetic material from an individual, we're talking about human embryo cloning now, taking the genetic material from an individual cell and getting that to go back to an embryonic state, an embryo-like entity, which can then be differentiated into something like the heart tissue that I showed you earlier on the slide, or into something like a pancreas or other kinds of tissues that could be used to cure human disease. And if you look at this map, there's a very interesting regional difference in terms of the way that societies look at embryo cloning. You look at the Western Hemisphere, the countries colored green have laws that specifically allow human embryo cloning. They make it legal. Okay, and the countries colored red make it illegal. Countries colored yellow have ambiguous laws, and everything else doesn't have a national law. The United States has no national laws governing human embryo cloning. You notice in the Western Hemisphere, there is no country that has come out proactively to make human embryo cloning legal. But if you look at Asia, it's basically every country in Asia that has every non-Christian country. There's a little red thing there, that's the Philippines, which is a Christian country. All the non-Christian countries in Asia that have any kind of scientific facilities have all legalized, specifically, proactively, embryo cloning. So what's the difference here? Well, in the Western world, the Western Hemisphere especially, is very, very much a Christian culture. All of these countries were, as we know, settled by Europeans. Many of the people who came to these countries were very religious, still are very religious. And so there's this idea of a God that creates life in each embryo, a new creation of life. And human embryo cloning violates that kind of religious belief, because man would be taking over the role of God in creating life and also manipulating life so that it becomes organs as opposed to human beings. That's sort of a Western Hemisphere way of looking at things. The Eastern countries are different. This is actually, that was my son there, playing music. But this is a woman who had died. I said she had died 6 months earlier. Her heart stopped beating. But her spirit, according to these people, was still inside of her until it was released in the smoke to go up to heaven, and then it comes back to earth and it reincarnates. And so in the Eastern tradition, first of all, there is no God. There is no monotheistic God. There are many gods or no gods, depending on how you define gods, but there's no single God telling you what to do. And individual lives or spirits don't begin like that. They've all existed since the beginning, and they all keep on existing till the end. Reincarnation just keeps on. Actually, the reincarnation allows the life to to evolve from one generation to the next. Very, very different view of life, and the implications are the people in these countries do not have a problem. There's no grassroots objections from any of the non-Christians in this country to embryo cloning. South Korea actually has a large Christian population, and that part of the population is trying to stop embryo cloning, but it's a minority in that part of the world. Now, I didn't talk about Europe because Europe is complicated. I'm going to come back to Europe right now in going to the next part of the talk, where I want to talk about the way in which we look at crops and the manipulation of crops. This is an advertisement that was a full-page advertisement in the New York Times from the year, I think it was 1998 when this was first published. There was a whole series of advertisements. And the advertisements were all basically anti-biotechnology advertisements. And the first one said, "Who plays God in the 21st century?" Now, what that's really saying, the term God can be used as specifically to represent the God of the Bible. But many people say you shouldn't play God who don't even believe in the God of the Bible. They're using it as a metaphor for who should have authority to decide the future of life on earth, which is basically the question being asked in this advertisement. Now, the traditional answer in the West, as I just told you, is the God of the Bible. That's who should have the authority to determine the future of life on earth. And if you read the Bible, in Genesis, right up front, God is supposed to create each human soul, each human being, human soul. And God has a divine plan for the future of humankind. I'm not going to talk about the implications of that, but you can read that in my book if you like. So God creates each human being. That's what he does. But God gives human beings dominion over plants and animals which don't have souls. They don't have immortal souls in the sense that each human being has an immortal soul. And this has implications because in the West, this is another map, okay, looking at the top 10 countries in terms of the area of genetically modified crops planted in the year 2004. And if you look at the Western Hemisphere, where there's a very deep Christian culture, you can see most of the top countries producing genetically modified crops are in the Western Hemisphere. Asia has no problem with this either, for reasons I can't go into right now, but look at the big red circle in the middle. That's Europe. So why are the Europeans so allergic to genetically modified crops and actually allergic to all forms of agricultural biotechnology? Well, it's an interesting survey that was done. The Europeans get surveyed every year by something called the Eurobarometer. And the Eurobarometer asked people to respond to this question. So it's actually not a question, it's a statement. The statement is, genetically modified food is dangerous. And then they divided up people basically based on education levels, how educated they were. And I think what is so interesting about this is that the least knowledgeable, least educated people, 48% said yes, genetically modified food is dangerous, 8% said no, and 44% said they didn't know. Okay? And what happened with education is when people, if you look at the highest, this is actually the highest education group over here, the number who thought genetically modified foods were dangerous is not significantly different in these two cases. What happens here, though, in more education, less people say they don't know, and more people say false. And I think what these data show is that there's a certain belief that genetically modified food is dangerous, and no amount of, in Europe, people who hold this belief, it doesn't matter how well or uneducated they might be. There are many extremely well-educated people that I've talked to who agree with this statement over here. But increased levels of education reduce the number of people who say they don't know and are willing to say false. Those who say they don't know, don't have enough information, are willing to say this. Now, why are the Europeans so opposed to genetically modified foods and other kinds of technologies, agricultural biotechnologies? And you can get some sense of this by looking at, again, the same survey, looking at the beliefs that people hold in Western Europe. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, this is a question asked them about what they think about God. Do they believe in a personal God? Do they believe in a higher power? And I'll show you the exact question. Or are they atheist or agnostic? Countries like Chile, this is the South American representative, but most of South America is like this. 91% believe in a personal God. That means a God who answers your prayers. You pray to the God, and the God answers your prayers. Only 3% are atheistic or agnostic. In the United States, 78% believe in this personal God. You can see the other numbers are a little bit higher. But now let's take a look at Europe and see what the story is there. The Europeans, and you can see all these countries over here in Europe, the number of people who have a traditional belief in the biblical God goes way, way down in Europe. Since World War II, traditional religion has gone much, much, much lower there. And in fact, if you ever travel through France, the churches are empty. My wife and I were in Holland last spring, and there's this wonderful cathedral in Haarlem, which is a city in Holland that we wanted to go to. And so Sunday morning, we took a train out to Haarlem. We went to the cathedral. There was a big sign on the door. It said, "Closed on Sunday," which explains the way the Dutch think about churches. You know, they're nice, they're beautiful cultural artifacts, but they're not, they're not important for religious purposes. But take a look at these numbers over here in the middle. So these people said, I don't believe in a personal God, but I do believe in a higher power of some kind. So it's sort of, they're coming away from a personal God, but a lot of people have a need to have some kind of spirituality. And so the spirituality gets transferred from personal God. I mean, a lot of people are theistic or agnostic in Europe, but you have a very large number in some countries in the middle here who have a different notion, a different spiritual notion than the traditional Christian notion. It's a higher power of some kind. And so what happens is that if you transfer in the traditional Christian idea, God is in the heavens, deciding how the earth should function, how people should behave on earth. And this kind of attitude of this monotheistic God in the heavens often comes down as transforms into a monotheistic God of earth. And Gaia is the term that's used from Greek mythology to describe the Mother Earth goddess. And so you have this transfer from God in the heavens to a God on earth. And I wanted to know that that's just a hypothesis, right? I mean, that's not what the question asked exactly. So I carried out a survey of Princeton undergraduate students. Princeton is a rather conservative school among the Ivy schools. It's probably the most conservative. And 80% of the students at Princeton self-identify, more than 80% self-identify as Christian. And so I asked a number of questions. And one of the questions I asked was, do you think that a multi-organismal entity, such as an ecosystem or the biosphere as a whole, can have a unified spiritual component? And I defined spiritual as immaterial. In other words, is the earth alive as an organism? And this is the answer. This is the answers that I got. 16 to 17% said, yes, the earth is alive as an organism. 61, depending on whether they're male or female. Large percentage said no, but there were a lot of people in the middle over there. About half of the students at Princeton, and I got the same result for freshmen and sophomores, which was the control. Half the students at Princeton think it's possible that the whole Earth is an organism. It shows you it's a very powerful belief that substitutes for the traditional Christian God. This is very much anti-Christian, I should say. In Christian view, as I said, each individual human being has a soul, but the Earth as a whole doesn't. And so it's kind of a post-Christian, modern, New Age belief in this Earth as a goddess. Now, here's the advertisements I showed you. I showed you the advertisement on the left. This is a series of advertisements that were put out by something called the Turning Point Project, which is directed by Andrew Kimbrell, who's a protege of Jeremy Rifkin, who's been an anti-biotech advocate for longer than anybody else. And you can see these big headlines here. Who plays God in the 21st century? Biotechnology equals hunger. Unlabeled, untested, you're eating it. And I want to go through and sort of tease apart to determine whether there's any truth in any of these advertisements and what really is going on here. But before I do that, this is a quote from Andrew Kimbrell to give you a sense of the way that he believes. He says, the US government's policies continue to be guided by the cold, objective values of quantification and measurability. They ignore intuition, emotional understanding, spiritual wisdom, and all the warm, subjective human values so needed for our healing and wholeness. Now, I would have thought that was a good idea, that we are objective. I thought governments should be objective and rational. He thinks it's a terrible idea. Okay? The continued reign of the cult of objectivity among our scientific and policy elites ensures the continuing spread of cold evil. So this is it's one person. It's the person that organized these advertisements. These advertisements were signed on to by organizations like the Sierra Club, Earth First, your favorite organization, ELF, I guess, Earth Liberation Front, I don't know what it's called. A number of organizations, some of which I used to contribute money to, and a lot of people who you wouldn't think would have this kind of point of view. Maybe they don't. But this is the leader of this group, and this is his point of view. Objectivity is bad, emotionality is good. We need emotional, subjective values to determine what's right and wrong in our society. So let's look at this first advertisement. Who plays God in the 21st century? This is right from the advertisement. The genetic structures of living beings are the last of nature's creatures to be invaded and altered for commerce. Nothing will ever be the same. And I just want to show you how uneducated this point of view is. This is a weed that grows in Mexico, in a particular valley in Mexico called Teosinte. And 10,000 years ago or so, the ancestors to the modern Mexican people captured the evolutionary process and turned this weed, which was basically inedible, and that's sort of the same size as this series of kernels here in the corn. They turned this wheat into corn, which provided food for the Central Americans, now provides food for lots of people all over the world. They captured the evolutionary process and they reshaped life on Earth. Most people don't know that. Bananas are really screwed up creatures. They're so screwed up they're sterile, which is why you have to clone them. They don't have seeds, right? So for the last 2,000 years they've been cloned. That's how we've maintained bananas, because they actually have a double number of chromosomes, which screws them up. Tomatoes and bananas were created in Southeast Asia. Tomatoes come from the Andes Mountains. They were bred out of a poisonous berry. Tiny little inedible berry was bred by South American people into the tomato. And the tomato was just in South America until the explorers from Europe came over. So whatever the Italians were eating in 1492, it wasn't spaghetti with tomato sauce. There were no tomatoes. There were no potatoes in Europe either. All of these things were created. Almost everything we eat today was created. Looks totally different than the way the organism that it was derived from. Apples come out of crab apples, which were inedible as well. So the evolutionary process has been captured in the past. We have reshaped life on Earth. One of the most dramatic, this is an incredible slide. You probably all know what's coming. This is Siberian wolf. You can see where the big bad wolf stories come from. It has its prey, which it's just killed, and is protecting over there. And we now know from genetic studies that this is the animal that gave rise to all those things over there on the right. Now, that's not capturing the evolutionary process and reshaping life on Earth. I don't know what is. And are those natural? If you put any of these animals out into the wild, I mean, they'd be eaten immediately, right? They can't survive without us. I don't have a dog at home, so as you can see, I don't care about them as much. Again, taking from the same advertisement, breaking the species barrier. Whether you give credit to God or to nature, there's a boundary between life forms that gives each its integrity and identity. Well, we've discovered with genetic analysis that people have been breaking the species boundary for a long time. And in fact, doing a genetic analysis of sheep that produce wool. Wool, by the way, is not natural. There was no wool until people bred animals to have wool coats like that. And the modern sheep that's used for wool, actually it's 3 different species that were forced together. Presumably they did not breed naturally in the wild. They were forced to breed in captivity. And the llama from South America, again, the llama is actually bred together from 2 species of different genera. I mean, these are 2 very different species, further apart than we are from chimpanzees. Now, the assumption that I would make is that people knew what they were doing. People 10,000 years ago were just as smart as we were. We seem to forget that sometimes. And probably they said, you know what, if we take these 2 very different kinds of species and we breed them together, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity that we could breed out different traits that we'd like. You would have to think they must have been thinking very specifically about purposely crossing so-called boundaries between life forms in order to get the traits. In terms of the llama, they wanted the fleece coat, which was what they wanted from there. This is another advertisement. So it just shows you that the people who have written these advertisements haven't taken the time to actually explore what they're saying and the truth in what they're saying. Another advertisement here is ecological agriculture. Let nature be the measure of our actions. What does that mean? It's trying to say, well, Mother Nature, we should be good, and Mother Nature will take care of us as long as we're good to Mother Nature, and she'll be nice to us in return. And here you have down here's their notion of ecological agriculture, these farmlands. I don't know where this picture was taken. They didn't know about something that, well, they didn't know about a lot of things, but one of the most interesting things about Mother Nature's wrath is what happened in the Sahara of Africa 4,000 years ago. Between 12,000 BC and 4,000 BC, the Sahara was a vast savanna. People lived there. There were animals there. There were lakes and rivers. Kind of looked like this. This is actually a picture from Ghana, northern Ghana. But that's the way the Sahara looked for 8,000 years. And there was a whole culture of people that lived there. And then what happened, because the Earth's climate changed, is very rapidly, within a period of 100 or 150 years, that's what it turned into. Okay? That's what Mother Nature did. This is nature in action in 4,000 BC. Not very kind to anyone, not very kind to any living thing. If you go to the Sahara Desert, it's basically lifeless. And the interesting thing, of course, is you could say to people, well, this is what Mother Nature looks like in the Sahara Desert. Might be possible to use technology to make the Sahara Desert green. Is that a good idea? Many people I've met have said, no, it's not a good idea to make the Sahara Desert green. I mean, obviously, it's going to have other effects around the world. But it doesn't matter. That's the way Mother Nature is, and we shouldn't, that's good. We should leave Mother Nature to be as it is. This is another example of Mother Nature in action. This is the town called Tikal in Guatemala. It was a city of 200,000 people, and about 1,000 is the Mayan civilization. About 1,000 years ago, the civilization collapsed. Nobody knows exactly why it collapsed. There was a long time of there was no rain for a very, very long time. Their agricultural activities were probably unsustainable. The civilization collapsed. 95% of the people died. And if you go there right now, and I'm going to show you a picture. This is what it's supposed to have looked like 1,000 years ago. I'm going to show you a picture looking at see where it says over there, Group F. This is what this city looks like today. So I'm standing on top of one temple, taking a picture of another temple, and there's Mother Nature in action. People left, jungle comes back. It's, the canopy is way, way up there in the air, and you can see the entire city is just covered in jungle. All of Central America used to be covered in cornfields, right? People cut down all the jungle. People disappear, jungle comes back. I mean, that's what Mother Nature is going to do. So what is this whole notion of this being ecological? Here you have these rows of crops right over here. And the idea that this is natural and ecologically friendly. And it's, it kind of looks like the Loire Valley. Here's a picture of the Loire Valley. If anybody's ever been there in France, it's a wonderful place to go. It's very pleasant with these meadows and these cows off there in the distance. My two sons are on scooters there in the middle. And many people this is what Mother Nature is. This is the notion of, good Mother Nature. In fact, this is active suppression of nature. If people left this land, if people all went extinct, this land would turn in 1,000 years back to the forests that were there before people cut down all the forests. People basically eliminated all the natural ecosystems in Europe, and they maintained this completely unnatural ecosystem here, completely unnatural environment with these fields of crops. The weeds are totally unnatural. Those are weeds that do well along the sides of roads. They're not weeds that do well in the forest. And even the trees that are growing there in the nice distance over there are trees that do well in that kind of an environment as opposed to a forest environment. This is completely human artifice. It is not natural at all, even though this is what we've come to think of as Mother Nature. The cows also are not natural. And all of the crops don't come from there. I mean, the crops are wheat and corn. They started out in one little place in the world, and people took them all over the world. I mean, corn is one of the most invasive species existing in the world right now. Coming back to the same advertisement here, healthy, poison-free food is what they want. And the idea, if you read further in the advertisement, is that organic farming is good. Organic farming respects the environment's own systems for controlling pests and disease, avoids the use of synthetic pesticides, and organic farmers use a range of techniques that help sustain ecosystems and reduce pollution. This is from the European Commission's definition of organic farming. Now, it's interesting because this it makes an assumption without any evidence. Organic farmers use a range of techniques that help sustain ecosystems and reduce pollution. How do you know that? You don't know that. There's no evidence that that's the case. It's an assumption that if you grow things using the organic system, that's natural, and if it's natural, therefore, it helps sustain ecosystems and reduce pollution. It's an assumption that's unproven. In fact, organic farmers do something that I didn't even know about until about a year ago, which is most people I talk to think that organic farmers can't use pesticides. You think organic food is pesticide-free unless some pesticides float in the air from a conventional farm. In fact, organic farmers can use pesticides, and their food can be perfectly labeled as certified organic if they use pesticides like these things, like pyrethrin. That's the chemical formula there. You can also use rotenone, which is a neurotoxin linked to Parkinson's disease. And here's a organic botanical that's used by organic gardeners. And so the question is, how come they can use these pesticides, and how can they be pesticide-free? Well, the answer is because these are natural pesticides. These are chemicals produced in plants. Rotenone actually is produced in a poisonous vine from India. And for hundreds of years, Indians have taken the leaves of this vine, grind them up, throw them in the water, and the fish all die. It's a toxin, a very serious toxin. They kill all the fish. And so that's, you can spray it on your strawberries and apples as well, and it'll kill the insects. And it's perfectly organic because it's natural. And so there's this disconnect in people's minds. If a plant makes it, it's natural, it's okay. And if we make it in the laboratory, then it's synthetic and it's bad. Now we can make pretty nasty chemicals in the laboratory, no question about it. But nature makes pretty nasty chemicals too. Some of them you may know, like strychnine is perfectly natural. Ricin is perfectly natural. These are very, very toxic poisons. Strychnine, by the way, is specifically prohibited from use on organic farms. But these chemicals are not. They're natural. Now, is organic farming intrinsically better for the environment? That's the statement that Jeremy Rifkin and his people make. And here's a pig. And the problem with pigs is that the ancestors of pigs were carnivorous. And that means that the wild boars ate everything. They ate eggs, and they ate insects and all sorts of creatures, and they were able to get one of the minerals that they require for growth is phosphate, and they would get the phosphate from the animal food that they ate. But when you do farming of pigs, it's much more efficient just to feed them grain. And if you feed them grain, what happens is the pigs cannot digest the phosphate in the grain. There's phosphate there. The pigs can't digest it. And so farmers have to put in supplemental phosphate because it's a required mineral. And so the phosphate that comes in the grain goes into the mouth, goes out the other side, could be used as organic fertilizer. Runoff causes depletion of oxygen, dead fish, algal blooms, and greenhouse gases. I mean, it's pretty nasty to have this phosphate going through like this. So there were two Canadian scientists who decided they were going to try to engineer a pig to overcome this problem. And so what they did is they took a gene for an enzyme called phytase. Now, this is a gene, this is a protein made by this gene that's present in E. coli. E. coli has a bad reputation because certain strains are lethal. But in fact, every one of you in this room has E. coli in your gut right now. You couldn't survive without them. So you take a good E. coli, and E. coli gene has this protein. E. coli are breaking down inside your gut all the time. So this protein is inside of you all the time, in your digestive tract. It gets broken down pretty quickly. They took this gene, they put it into the pig genome, and what this gene does is that it breaks down the chemical that contains phosphate from the grain. And what happened now is that these animals that are genetically engineered with this gene, they produce this protein in their saliva. The saliva extracts the phosphate. The farmers don't need to use supplemental phosphate anymore. And the good thing about this, and this is the paper that was published showing this, the good thing about this for the environment is that it reduces by 70%, right? The first animals they got, the amount of phosphate in the manure was reduced by 70%, which seems to me to be good for the environment. So the phosphate went in, it was absorbed. You don't need supplemental phosphate. And in theory, you can go to the point where you could reduce it even more, which would be a serious advantage for raising pigs. Now, the problem is that no matter where this technology goes in the future, it is unacceptable for use in organic farms because organic farmers reject all uses of lab gene modification. And the point here, there's many, many different kinds of genetic modifications you can do. This particular one I'm using on purpose. You're going to say it's not fair. I'm using it on purpose because everything we know about the biology and the biochemistry of this particular modification says that this should be good for the environment. There should be no negative effects in human beings because we already have this protein in us anyway. And when you cook the meat, the protein is going to digest. And so if you think about it rationally, this should be good. There should be a benefit that outweighs any risk that you can imagine. And the reason to object to this is not because of science. It's because of faith. It's not the traditional Christian faith. It's a new kind of faith. Another advertisement from this group. Unlabeled, untested, and you're eating it. They're talking about genetically modified foods. They're saying that we should label all foods if they're genetically modified. And this is true, maybe. It is unlabeled. Untested is not true. I don't know how they can get away saying that. And you're eating it is true. Everybody in America has been eating genetically modified foods for the last 10 years. Now, this whole question of labeling says that we should label it because it's potentially dangerous and we should know what's in our food. Perhaps. But then the question is everything in a cup of organic coffee labeled? And these are some of the chemicals in a cup of organic coffee. They're also in a cup of non-organic coffee. Acetaldehyde, benzaldehyde, benzene. You got all these chemicals. They're all there in coffee. And they're all classified as carcinogenic according to the Ames test. You put that on the side, a label, and saying, beware, these are all the carcinogenic chemicals you're putting into your body every time you drink a cup of coffee. Nobody would drink coffee anymore. But in fact, most foods have carcinogenic chemicals in them. These are chemicals the plant has made to protect itself from predators. Now, scientists don't care so much. You say, well, why don't they know this? Well, the answer is the people who actually know this say, yeah, they're carcinogenic. Maybe they'll cause cancer in 1 out of 100,000 people 1 out of 10,000 people maybe at most. But you know what? We take those risks. You take lots of other risks which are much, much greater than the risk of having these really low-level carcinogens in your coffee and your spinach and everything else that you eat. So the idea that genetically modified foods are going to be more dangerous than this, there's no evidence. Is genetically modified food going to be 100% safe, with absolutely no risk? No scientist can ever say that about anything, including coffee. Some people are going to die from coffee. It's just the way it's going to be. This is an amazing advertisement. Biotechnology equals hunger. And this one is the one that made me most furious, actually. It says that former self-sufficient farmers now swell the ranks of the world's 800 million hungry. Small farmers face higher costs. Consumers are mounting protests. Now, I find this very interesting because the question is, where are the starving, protesting farmers and consumers? I don't want to be racist here. But this woman doesn't look like she comes from a poor country. She looks pretty Northern European to me. And so who's starving? Who's protesting? Well, maybe she's protesting, but she's well-fed. She's not starving. Where are the protesting farmers and consumers? I want to go more quickly through this. The real truth of the matter, whoops. There's a slide here that's missing. Let's see if I can find it. There it is. OK. If you actually go and travel to these countries around the world, places like Vietnam, Thailand, Ghana, Indonesia, India, Belize, these people have plenty of food. And the reason they have plenty of food is because the Green Revolution, which was sort of a primitive form of biotechnology, provided them with advanced ways of growing crops. And there's not starving people here. So this biotechnology equals hunger doesn't make sense to me. There are places in the world where people are starving for political reasons. But all of these countries where you normally think people are starving, my family went through all of these countries, there's tons of food. The problem is not getting food. I mean, they don't have enough medicine, but there's tons and tons of food here. Paul Ehrlich is a man who thought everybody was going to starve. He wrote a book, a very important book, in 1968 called The Population Bomb. And he was very worried about starvation. He said the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. And so these are some of the predictions he made and some of the statistics. 1969 said by 1980, American life expectancy will drop to 42 because of pesticides. This is life expectancy from 1960 to 2003. It is not what he said was going to happen. In 1970, this is the year he said it, by 1975, widespread famines will begin in India. In fact, it didn't happen. India couldn't support itself in the 1960s, but with Green Revolution rice, it was actually exporting food by the 1990s. And this is the food production. This is actually the life expectancy in India. And you can see that life expectancy is going up in India. So that was wrong as well. In 1975, he said, one general prediction can be made with confidence. The cost of feeding yourself and your family will continue to increase. And this is the price for rice. And in fact, it goes for every other crop as well. The price has dropped in using the same dollar figures for the years, adjusting for that. In fact, the price of food has gone way, way down, while productivity has gone up. So in every one of these cases, Paul Ehrlich was wrong. And the question is, why did he, if he's been wrong in every single case, why has he been awarded all of these prizes? You know, it's okay to be wrong. I've been wrong lots of times, but I don't get prizes for being wrong. And yet people will keep on giving, he's won all of these very important prizes, the Heinz Award, Blue Planet Prize, all of these prizes for his predictions, which turned out not to be the case. And the only way I can think of this is that Ehrlich and those who give him awards refuse to accept the objective evidence that biotechnology can be better than Mother Nature at alleviating human suffering and ecosystem suffering. Now, there's a problem. And this is the problem. It's a picture of my family planting rice on the island of Java, the biggest island in Indonesia. And this is, by the way, Green Revolution rice. It's not rice that's been around for thousands of years. It was rice produced by the Green Revolution through mutagenesis in the 60s and 70s. And the problem is that all of Java looks like this. Java is one big rice paddy. Now, that means that all the jungle that used to exist in Java is gone. And this is a basic problem because there's this trade-off. You know, if you have agriculture, you're growing rice, you're growing any food, you have to eliminate ecosystems. You chop down forest and jungle, which, you know, the smaller, if you eliminate ecosystem, you're going to eliminate species, all species are going to go extinct, but you need agriculture to sustain human life. And so there's this battle between agriculture to sustain human life versus wilderness, which is also very important for the world. And the problem is that today, 53% of the world's landmass is used in agriculture in urban areas. Most of that, I mean, urban area is actually a small part of that. Most of it is agriculture. Most of it is cropland and pastures. 53, that means half of the world's surface is being used in agriculture. And there's only so much land on Earth. And so the only amount left is 47% for everything else. The UN predicts that by 2050, we're going to need 65% of the land mass in agriculture, which, because it's a zero-sum game, is going to reduce the amount available for forest parks and desert, the yin-yang of agriculture and wilderness. So what do we do about this? What can we do about this? This is a picture of this is one of those NASA pictures which puts together all these nighttime pictures of the Earth to show you where people are around the planet. And how can people wilderness both be sustained? Well, the answer, in my mind, is only through the use of biotechnology targeted at growing more food and less land with less impact on the environment at large. If you give up land, if you stop planting crops on a piece of land, it will go back to wilderness. That's what will happen. That's what I showed you happened in Central America. And unless you get to the point, you know, beyond return, you give up land, it goes back into wilderness. And I think that's what we have to think about doing. It's not happening because this technology is not being used for this purpose right now. I mean, during the Green Revolution, the public sector played a huge role in bringing the technology to poor people and to the problems of hunger and rural poverty. Now the technology is being used basically in America and China also, and it's not benefiting poor people. And why is it not being used to help the environment, to help humankind, help poorer people? Well, this is the problem. Charles Margolis, who's a spokesperson for Greenpeace International, explained they were not interested in better regulation of GM crops. They were opposed to all field applications. In other words, they don't want biotechnology. This is not to do, which means that they don't really care about whether it's better for humankind or not, whether it's better for the environment or not. They're opposed right from the beginning, unconditionally opposed, categorically opposed to the use of this technology, which I think is a bad thing. Biotechnology could bring benefits to humanity and the environment, but only if humanitarians and environmentalists overcome subliminal Mother Nature worship, accept objective science, and come to the table to work with scientists and policymakers. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions. Yes, over there.
One of the really interesting ethical questions that I've had a hard time sorting out is where we've had, an example here would be the genes that have been developed for such things as Roundup resistance, where they've been selectively put into different crops for specific applications. And you could argue the advantages and disadvantages of that. The question is, how do we view those capabilities where they're beginning to spread to non-target species, where we had one focused direction and impact, but it's now beginning to move out into a broader genomic pool? How do we view that? What do we do with that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that notion. So let me just say, I think that every use of the technology should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I'm not saying we accept it all. I think we look at it on a case-by-case basis. We look at the benefits and costs, and a society has to decide what are costs that we're willing to accept. I'll give you an example of something that we accept, even though it has costs in terms of human lives. We have peanuts. We use peanuts in processed food. We use soy in processed food, even though we know that there are going to be 100 children a year in America that die because of the use of soy and peanuts in processed food. And thousands are going to go because there's allergic reactions in 1 to 5% of all children. Now, it sounds horrible to say, but society has made the choice to accept that. The benefits outweigh the cost of losing 100 lives in America alone, thousands of people having allergic reactions. I mean, organic farmers accept that. Organic farmers kill people by growing peanuts and soy. So I don't have an answer to that. I would say that we use each, we had to look at each on a case-by-case basis. If you think there's a problem, one of the things you can do, instead of rejecting the technologies, go back and say to the technologist, we think there's a problem, modify it so that we can eliminate the problem or reduce the problem. But risk doesn't make sense in isolation. Risk only makes sense in comparison. Okay, that's why I don't have a problem drinking coffee in the morning, because I take other risks that are greater than coffee. I see you have your hand up for a long time.
Do you think that the lack of generalized knowledge for this type of stuff is why people reject it, or do you think that it has to do with a primarily faith-based knowledge?
I think there are different kinds of, that's one of the things I showed you with the statistics. People hear things from the news, and then you get worried. There's a newspaper article that says, such and such a thing's going to kill you, and then everybody gets all upset about it. And because they read the newspaper, they believe what the newspaper says, and then they get worried because and the reporters are responsible sometimes for over-interpreting and exaggerating risks or benefits, for that matter. So I understand how people can, have a false impression of the risks of something. What I have a problem with is the people that I argue with, where I take a rational point of view, like with the pig, for example, and they argue that there are these unknown risks. We don't know what they are. You can never know what they are, and therefore we shouldn't do it. I have a problem with that attitude. Everything we do in life has risks, true, but we have to compare the risks of doing and not doing things. Yes?
I was just going to point out that genetically modified food is dangerous is such a broad statement that you couldn't possibly understand how the person was answering it, because they might be thinking nutrition-wise, is it dangerous to biodiversity? Is it dangerous to the economic system of farmers? Different people are going to read the question differently and think about it in totally different ways, and then you interpreted it a different way than I did. And
so if you actually talk to people in Europe, and I have done this with hundreds of people, there is the sense that it's poisonous. There's an African country of, I think, was it Zambia? Zambia, where there are a whole bunch of African countries which rejected rejected free food from America, which had genetically modified grains. There was a political problem at first because they didn't want the genetically modified grains to come in because they worried it would get into their stock and then they wouldn't be able to export to Europe. Europe controls the world here, basically, right? Because everybody's afraid of Europe rejecting their food. So the Americans said, okay, we're going to grind it up. We're going to, whatever that's called, mill it. Thank you. We're going to mill it. And so all the countries except one said, okay, we'll take the milled food. So they didn't really believe it was poisonous. One country said, it's poisonous. We don't want this poison coming into our country. Now that means basically he said it's okay for people to die of famine. We're going to sacrifice those people. It's, what kind of poison, could be worse than causing death? I don't know. But in fact, if you talk to Europeans, which I have done, many Europeans on the ground believe that the food's going to hurt them personally. Many Americans believe that too. You talk to people. You're right. It's not my survey. It's somebody else's survey question. It's a bad question. But there are a lot of people who think it's going to poison them when the fact is that all of the GM products that are commercially available in the United States right now have not done anything. Nobody's been harmed by them. Doesn't mean that now I don't want to say GM products isn't something I can imagine that's going to cause harm. Yeah, but there's no evidence yet that anything that's been approved has been harmful. Yes, in the back. Yeah.
Just a few points, because there are quite a few I would disagree with you on. One.
Fire away.
Okay. one just personal one. I just can't let go. I'm sorry. You mentioned, this is a direct quote, I believe, that Charles Margolis
Yes.
doesn't really care if it's better for humankind or the environment. Charles happens to be a friend of mine. I happened to be talking to him this morning, and I can assure you you're quite wrong on that. He really does care. So I'm just going to, we'll just have to agree to disagree on that.
Well, I'll send you it was a CBS interview, actually. He responded to a reporter, and you can see a transcript of it. This is not a direct quote, by the way.
Okay. Well, I'm direct quoting from you, what you said about him. So I'm sorry, I can't let that go.
Okay.
Second, in terms of your solution for world hunger, one point I agree with you on was that there's more than enough food to go around right now, which is accurate. The problem is poverty and distribution and storage. That is the problem. But your solution is, well, we've got to have biotech to solve world hunger.
I never said that.
You did?
No, I did not.
Oh, I thought you did. I misunderstood.
No, I did not.
Okay.
I agree with you. There's plenty of food.
Okay.
I think the problem is wilderness, not world hunger. The problem is that every acre of land used for agriculture is an acre taken away from wilderness.
I have no argument with that. That's fine.
Okay.
But this is.
I mean, that was an example of where it's not hunger.
The biotech industry constantly promotes we've got to have genetic engineering to cure world hunger. Okay. And what I object to is when you take an acre of land that's a monoculture and compare it, like say wheat or corn, and take an acre of land that's used to produce mixed different kinds of vegetables and like that, every time, or virtually every time, that's going to be producing more food for people to eat than the monoculture. So, but with genetically engineered foods, they're almost constantly, because it's corn and it's canola and it's soybeans, you're talking more monoculture.
Well,
That's the central problem with the way genetically engineered food has been developed in the world.
Okay, so let me respond to that. Okay, as a geneticist, I take exception to that because if you have a useful trait that you have in a particular variety, like rice or wheat or something, for generations, farmers have been able to take that trait with classical genetics and breed it into other varieties and produce many, many more varieties. So in fact, they've done that with the GM traits as well. And you don't grow the same corn in Idaho that you grow in the southern United States. I don't know where this monoculture notion comes from. There are many, many, many varieties for each of these crops.
It comes from what's happening in the third world, where you're taking farmers that could make their own living by growing their own food, taking that out and putting in monocultures of soybeans, like they've done in Argentina, or cutting down the rainforest in Brazil, which is there's your nature right there, and planting these monocultures for export.
This is an economic issue, okay? But the one country where I've heard this argument many times. I traveled across India for 6 weeks, and have you been to India?
No, I haven't.
Okay. India is a country of small farmers. It is not giant corporate farms. There are lots of small farmers in a community. They take their grain, they put it together into a communal grain, whatever it's called, bin. I don't understand where that rejection comes from. And in fact, India is filled with small farmers. India has a long way to go, but they're not starving people there as Paul Ehrlich predicted there were going to be. In Indonesia, there's not starving people there. So, I mean, you have an economic objection, which is a completely separate thing. I didn't show you the slide, but this is the impact of the Green Revolution, just in terms of, you look at Indonesia, which is really unbelievable, which is that the amount of food increased up 250% on the same amount of land. I mean, the idea, no, you're right. Hunger is not the problem. The problem is being able to produce that food on less land.
I'll let others.
Okay.
I've got a lot more.
Go ahead.
With the nature of the human species, do you feel that it's realistic to believe that this technology, if developed, would be used to preserve wilderness?
But the nature of the human species. I mean, that requires coordination at a higher level. It's not individuals who are going to be preserving wilderness. You need regulation. You need a higher level saying, here's a problem, this is the way we want to solve the problem. I mean, with the green, if you look at this, I love this picture over here, which I didn't go through very much. That's in Vietnam. Vietnam is growing corn, right? I mean, you know, all this corn's an invasive species. Corn comes from Central America. In fact, the Vietnamese don't even eat corn. So why are they growing corn? You know why? They don't eat it. It's for the pigs, right? You look at all of these countries over here. I mean, you have to have a higher level authority that says this is a value for humankind to preserve wilderness so that we can reduce the rate of species extinction. It's a serious problem. You know, and it's very, very clear that the smaller the area of wilderness, the more difficult it is for a species to maintain itself.
You're saying that, given that that's not a value that a lot of people uphold to preserve wilderness, that if you give the human species the ability to grow crops more condensed, don't you think that we would just take advantage of that and grow more crops in a more condensed area, you know, using less volume, and then that would just
then what do you use the other land for?
In the population and an increase.
Well, no, but you see this. There's
cause an even worse problem in the end.
So there's an interesting fact that all the demographers failed to predict, which is that the richer a country becomes, the lower its birth rate goes. Right? I mean, there's a population problem in Japan. They're very upset because the population's going down. There's a population problem in Italy. I mean, this is the opposite of the population problem that Paul Ehrlich predicted. And a lot of sociologists say, you know, country becomes rich, you don't have infant mortality, women are educated and have opportunities, therefore they don't want to stay pregnant all the time, and they reduce the number of children they have. And so this is interesting. You know, industrialization is a way to reduce population, and there's no forcing by any government. It's just, you know, making a society wealthier. So and you know, we live longer too, and the population's still going down. So all those predictions of population explosion turned out to be wrong. I mean, it still could happen in the future. You can't predict the future, but you know, more food, better health doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a greater population. Yeah.
As scientists, I came into this lecture thinking that GM has possibilities and it should be on a case-by-case basis. But starting with your quote amoeba, that is a paramecium, not an amoeba.
Sorry about that. I never had a biology course.
And the generalizations you've made and the lack of relevant information that is needed that you have not given, like your characterization of the Green Revolution, which has had lots of problems. It feels to me like this has been a very distortion of facts, and it makes me now much more apprehensive about GM.
If you want to see, I mean, you cannot, in a 50-minute lecture, present all the facts. I wrote...
You're right, but the way, you know...
Here's the picture I showed you.
Yes.
The paramecium on the left.
Now you've taken the whiting off behind.
Okay. In the middle, human cells. And on the right, human embryo. Okay. And the point I was trying to make by this is that, you know, those paramecia, thank you, you know, they swing around and they're alive. The cells in the middle, in my perspective, are microorganisms. That was the point I was trying to make, just like the paramecia.
But just like the mislabeling of that, you make points on the basis of very selected information.
So give me an example.
The Green Revolution was one.
Okay, what was wrong with the Green Revolution?
Well, I'll turn that over to you.
I can give you an example.
Go ahead.
You attributed aspirin as a triumph of biotechnology. Native Americans discovered if you chewed willow bark, salix bark, it contains salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is aspirin. That's not genetic modification of anything.
No.
Biotechnology.
No, the aspirin is purified. Right, that's what the pharmaceutical. Most pharmaceuticals come from, the original pharmaceuticals came from plants. Yeah, I agree with that. I think with the Green Revolution, I mean, I hear economic objections to the Green Revolution, but what I don't hear is anybody objecting to what, who's it, Ralph? Sorry?
The heavy use of fertilizers.
Well, see, but that's, well, but you know, not everybody's using fertilizers. The rice paddies that I showed you in Indonesia, they're not using fertilizers. This Green Revolution rice, it's planted 4 times a year because of the Green Revolution, and it supports the people there. 250% increase in productivity. Yeah, I know about the varieties that can, you know, that require heavy uses of fertilizer, but you know, in India, they're very poor people in India. So do you think it would have been better to not give them?
Well, you say they aren't serving people in India. Go ahead.
No, tell me about India. The people are not starving.
You're asserting again that the problem is food supply, when you agreed a minute ago it's food distribution. Perhaps the Green Revolution didn't save as many lives as you're suggesting. How can we tell?
How can we tell? We can tell because there's not massive famine in India, as Paul Ehrlich predicted. Now, I went back and read Paul Ehrlich's paper, and it was based on the levels of productivity that were possible in 1968, and that's how he predicted 600 million Indians were going to die of starvation. He was wrong. And the reason he was wrong is because his productivity was here, and the Green Revolution increased the productivity up to there. And, you know, I'd like to hear an argument against that, but that's just, you know, that's a fact. Yes?
But the planet is dying now.
What is?
So, you know, in global warming, there's so many problems that we need to fix that maybe this type of increase in productivity isn't a good thing because we're not using it in the right way.
So this is the worst thing.
Earlier, as the nature of human species and greed and our need for manifest destiny and not conservation, and you know, our need for expansion and exploration and all of that, you know, those are inherent in our species, not to conserve and hold back and to use our technologies in a conservative type of way.
Well, the worst thing that ever happened to the rest of the world was agriculture, right? Look at it. I mean, that used to be jungle. All of Java was jungle. So agriculture 10,000 years ago wiped out tons and tons of ecosystems. We have to, now, you know, is that good? Bad? I don't know. I don't place a value judgment on it. If it wasn't for agriculture, the population of the world would not have gone to where it is now. Maybe that's not a good thing, and if it wasn't for agriculture, there would have been, you know, starvation. I mean, the size of the human species was maintained at a very, very level for a very, very long time because it was impossible to support a larger population just by foraging and hunting. So agriculture increased the world's population and eliminated most ecosystems in the world. Now, so that's where we are. Okay, so then the question is, what do you do about that? What would you recommend?
I would recommend keeping our limitations and the cap on what the Earth can give us at this time at where it is, and not try to take even more out of it, which will just lead to more people and...
How, well, see, the interesting thing about biotechnology is the energy for this kind of rice growing comes from the sun. And the sun's energy is basically, we use 0.1% of the sunlight that hits the Earth, actually, in our energy usage every day. So the idea is to make better use of solar energy, to reduce, to use it better, to use it more effectively, to reduce the amount of land you need to produce crops. I mean, there's lots of things, you know, I may be completely wrong, but I think the important thing is to look at this with an open mind, look at the costs and benefits. Green Revolution, may have had some horrible costs, but the benefits were it eliminated or prevented famine in a large number of third world countries.
If used to preserve wilderness, I think this would be a great technology. I just don't know if that's realistic. That's all I'm saying.
I think one more question before my voice.
There's one over here.
Yes, you know, it's really interesting, maybe to come to your defense a little bit, and this slide is the perfect example of it. I work in the sustainable forest industry all over the world, and one of the unusual things that we found is that not so much genetic modification, but hybridization has allowed us to create plantations, forest plantations, on much smaller plats of land where we're able to, you know, grow significant volumes to protect natural environments and natural wilderness in the process throughout the world. So it's not always the case of agriculture versus wilderness that you see. And, you know, it just strikes me that everything is conversation and balance. I guess the one question I would have for you...
Well, let me just respond to that, okay? Because I agree with you completely, but the agriculture versus wilderness is just an idea of a zero-sum.
I understand.
You know.
I understand.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me ask the question to you. Any good lecturer, which you are, is always prepared because you play a devil's advocate role in terms of the dialogue that you have and the information that you give out. I would ask you to critique your own presentations and your own position. What would you say?
To critique, well, I would go along with what the gentleman over here said. And as I said, again, this is in my book. There's been a lot of bad science if you define science as the practice of science. Science can be defined either as the practice of science, what scientists do, or as a kind of an abstract idea of the laws of nature, how the world works. And scientists are supposedly trying to figure out the laws of nature. Technologists try to use science. Scientists are human. Scientists make lots of mistakes. Scientists can be biased. I teach actually a course to graduate students about the great difficulty of not being biased, because you're a human being. You look at your data. You want it to work. You want the experiment to work. And that causes lots and lots of problems. So people will take data and subconsciously just manipulate what the conclusion is, or whether there's no conclusion. And that happens too much. I agree with that completely. As you said, I'm an advocate. I'm not an advocate, rather. I'm a provocateur. And I try to provoke people to think about these things. I was provoked. You know, we spent the day planting rice there on Java Island. I'm giving you a contrary point of view. Technology can be used for good things. It can be used for bad things. There are unintended consequences. No question in my mind about that. Some of the uses of GM crops are going to cause problems that we didn't expect. Okay? And the same thing's happened with medicine in the past. I mean, there's been some gigantic medical blunders. There's going to be some gigantic GM blunders as well. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. I think what I'm trying to do here, you've all heard the case against GM crops. And I'm presenting here, I'm not defending GM crops, I'm defending open-mindedness and thinking about these issues, thinking about the history of technology and civilization. You know, was it a good thing we invented agriculture? I don't know, you know, because, you know, it depends on whether you think it's a good thing that there's 6 billion people in the world, or maybe we should have, you know, the human species would have been fine with 10 million or whatever else the world could support without agriculture. So it's up to, I would say my last point, and then I'll sort of go off to the cookies then. I'm not telling anybody what to do. I think that in both cases, with embryo stem cells, with GM, society has to make the decision. I do not believe scientists should be making decisions. I think society as a whole makes that decision. I think scientists can inform society. Other societies, like in England, for example, they have formal commissions that actually represent intelligent people with expertise who go and talk to the people, and they have some very reasonable rules they put into place concerning embryonic stem cells and the technology. I mean, England works fine. This country for 6 years didn't care about expertise or anything. Okay. But in the end, I mean, the only thing I can do is educate, and society has to make the decision. Different societies may come to different conclusions. That's the way it's going to be. Thanks.